Building building a secure community takes a lot of work. I mean, this is not easy. This is not about us just saying, "Oh, this is going to be the theme," and we're going to tell you this, and then we're all going to go and do whatever it is that we want to do. So the whole idea today was for you to start thinking about, who's the person beside you, what's the company, the college, the partner that you can establish. So please keep doing that. Keep that in mind. And as you might know, some of our institutions are faced constantly by multi-stage attacks. Many times they follow really just common tactics, techniques, and procedures. And we can learn a whole lot about that. So our keynote speaker today will talk about how we can turn the tables and make cyber criminals as miserable as they make us. And this is really great. So Ryan Kalember is an executive vice president for cybersecurity strategy with Proofpoint, one of our gold partners. He has provided cybersecurity counsel to global government delegations. He's a board member of the U.S. National Cybersecurity Alliance, and you probably know them as Stay Safe Online. So has anybody ever checked out Stay Safe Online here? If you haven't, take a look. Great information, lots of really useful things that you can bring in back to your institutions, to your community. They really have, it's a really great resource. So pay attention to those. He's also on the board of the Aspens Institute Cybersecurity Group and the Cybersecurity Technical Advisory Board. But that's not all. I mean, he's also a go-to source for breaking security news. And when you look at the agenda, you can take a look at some of the work that he has done. It's really impressive. So please help me welcome Ryan Kalember to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank all of you for making your way back into this room. It was getting a little worrisome a couple minutes ago, but I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, actually back in Eugene. I did a bio slide, unlike Marjorie, but just really, really briefly about me. I've actually been in cybersecurity for 23 years now, since I was an undergraduate at a different Pac-12 institution, but it doesn't matter now because we can all be friends. I did have the good sense, though, to marry a duck. I did not have the good sense to rephrase that in terms of my wife went to college, because saying I married a duck is an objectively strange thing to say on stage. That said, though, Jose's right. Actually, the work I do on the nonprofit side with National Cybersecurity Alliance, largely funded by CISA, actually, thanks to our friends in the back room there, is great. And we actually created Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Please, please never abbreviate that one. But let's get into the topic, right? We got to talk about what is actually happening a little bit more concretely, and I absolutely, absolutely love that Marjorie started with identity. Because if I were summarizing the meaningful parts of what attackers depend on, that they absolutely cannot live without, most of that is people and the identities that are connected to those people. People are always going to be very, very different. Even things like social engineering work very differently in different places. The last university keynote I gave, actually, was for Ohio State. All right, I should say The Ohio State University, sorry for whoever holds that copyright, in Columbus, Ohio. And I went on right after the CIO, who, in an unbelievable display of post-irony kind of chanting, led the entire crowd in an Ohio chant. No irony, no sense of I'm too cool for this. It was just complete and total earnestness. And then I realized at that moment, you and we are not the same. I am not up here, and I'm not going to be leading any chants. But it kind of registered to me that the social engineering that works in Columbus, Ohio, might be a little different than the social engineering that works out here in Eugene, Oregon. But the threat landscape, to a large extent, encompasses multitudes. It really is all about human targeting. The vast, vast, vast majority of attacks that we see are also human activated, meaning they depend on human error in some way, shape, or form. Human error takes a lot of things into account, obviously. Most of it does tie in a pretty direct sense to social engineering, and I'll get into some of the details behind that. But the last element, I think, is also a really critical one. As much as Jose put it earlier, we do need to build connections amongst each other to solve broader cybersecurity problems. Attackers take advantage of that too. Digital identity is unbelievably malleable, and human connections are the baseline for so many of even the most advanced attacks. That plays out in interesting and unpredictable ways, but ultimately it does kind of define a huge amount of what we try and tackle. So let's actually start with some data. If you were here for Sam's presentation, she said something about our dashboards, but we are fortunate enough to be trusted to protect a lot of the people here at the University of Oregon, and this is what attackers are trying every day. You know, Marjorie mentioned at Oregon State, you just have 24/7, 365 phishing. That's basically true everywhere. Why? Because it works. Right? The vast, vast, vast majority of the attacks launched at every organization on planet Earth, with very few exceptions, will be in this order: give me your credentials, run my malware for me, and there are flavors to that, which we'll get into in terms of some nuance that I think is important, or just simply give me money. Like, it's an unbelievably simple thing to do, but ultimately, that's where human communication ultimately provides the grist for the mill for the modern threat landscape. And this is what it's looked like since the beginning of September, since everyone went back to school here at Oregon. Now, there's a lot of different ways to parse this data. You know, if you were here for the FBI session earlier, you heard a lot about different ransomware groups. In most of the cases that the messages are broad enough that they can be campaigned, really grouped, attributed to an actor, you'll see one of two patterns. And the Oregon data is no different here. Threat actor 569, you probably know them better as Evil Corp. They go by a lot of different names. Sot Golish is the malware that they depend on pretty heavily at the moment. Interestingly, Google helps them do a huge amount of their work because they do a lot of malvertising in addition to targeted phishing. So getting a URL in front of somebody in a way that they might not expect. Number one threat actor targeting Oregon today. The other two groups there, 571 and 582, if you have seen anything in the news around the Qbot or Quackbot, I had to talk about Quackbot being at the University of Oregon. That was... Honestly, our threat research team, who I have the privilege of somewhat leading, they loved Qbot because it was always interesting. They would do new things on a regular basis, and every once in a while, the industry comes together. We usually work with a lot of law enforcement. We provided a lot of information to help with the Quackbot takedown, and you knock the thing offline. And ideally, you do it in a way that was exactly what DOJ and the FBI did with Quackbot, meaning you take over their entire infrastructure, and not only do you take it down, you use their infrastructure to basically patch and remove malware from all of the computers that have been infected. And that's amazing. Everything that we do that has that kind of an impact is worth celebrating. Unfortunately, literally the next day, two different groups using very similar malware, threat actor 571 and 582, took over Qbot's role in the broader ecosystem. That's just going to happen, right? It is very much whack-a-mole when it comes to that. There are two groups, though, that, ignoring our bizarre naming convention, no one in cybersecurity can agree on what we should call stuff, which is a huge, huge problem. We have to map to, which spiders these things are, as well as I'm not even going to comment on the Microsoft nomenclature where you get things like Mint Sandstorm that I cannot say with a straight face, but ultimately we do try and track the same groups in different ways. We just put a 2 in front of all the groups that are what we would call business email compromise style groups. They're really just looking to steal money. They want to know when money is moving from point A to point B, and they want point B to be themselves instead. There are lots of ways to pull that off, but that's ultimately what they're after. And if you look at the Oregon threat data right now, there's two groups there, 2536, who we also track as modest because that's the name in a lot of their malware. They appear to be actually Nigerian in origin and sort of operational locus, as well as 2715, which seems to be Moroccan based on our data. Those are the two targeting Oregon right now. So interesting stuff. That doesn't help us do much against any of those attacks, but it's good to know. What's maybe more important is how the attacks actually work in practice. And again, this is data here. This is not actually meant to be an eye test. We are not at the DMV right now. But if you, I'll read out some of that to you. If you think about the techniques that are used in the vast majority of these targeted attacks, you're going to see basically two major categories. Attacks against internet-facing stuff. Some of those can use vulnerabilities. And then attacks against people. Most of those do not use vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities pop up, they get patched, and they don't usually live that long of a life. So attackers have learned to live without them, because if you find a vulnerable human, they will keep delivering for you. That exploit chain might not work again when you burn it on a really, really, really nice attack. Like, imagine how that one group in the People's Republic of China feels about their State Department hack right now. They had a signing key. They could mint access to any Microsoft account on planet Earth, and they had to use it to steal 60,000 emails from the State Department. They are probably very sad right now that that's the only thing they got to use that unbelievable exploit chain for. But again, they're going to go back to the well, and they'll find something else that'll probably not depend on stealing key material from a crash dump when they've compromised a Microsoft engineer. Brilliant hacking, for the record. You have to kind of hand it to them on that front. But everything else they do is probably going to depend on what we've seen the other Chinese Nexus groups do lately, which is to just send people code and ask them to run it. That's, in fact, what you see in the Oregon data right now. JavaScript, sending people HTML and using a technique called HTML smuggling, which kind of reassembles something on a device, hard for EDR to catch. Sending people LNK, link files. Why do those even exist? It's the shortcut thing you get on your desktop, but it also can run malware, right? All of these things are built into our systems, and unfortunately, are really simple and effective ways to exploit human vulnerability. Now, I also loved in Marjorie's presentation that she talked about the importance of basically phishing-resistant MFA. Why is phishing-resistant MFA so important? Well, I wanted to show you actually something that we've seen very frequently in the Oregon threat data that aligns to a couple of the different threat actors that we track, including 2536 that we talked about earlier, and it is called evil proxy. Anybody heard of evil proxy or adversary in the middle phishing? Maybe more of you on that one. All right, so this is how it's sold. It gives you some baseline for which big companies do a better job with account takeover than others. Google's, in fact, more expensive to compromise than Microsoft, which is a bit of an upset. But if you actually log into evil proxy, and the threat research team and I did this recently, this is what you see as a user. So first, yes, you fell for the phishing link. You clicked on something that is obviously not something that you're supposed to click on. But most of you are probably using Microsoft or Okta or something as an identity provider. The first thing you're going to see is exactly what you expect to see. It'll probably even have a pre-populated credential that is your credential. Because this isn't a copy of the Microsoft login page. It is the Microsoft login page being loaded live. And if you put the right password in, they just proxy that back to the IDP and then show you what comes next. If you put in an authenticator code, and it's the right code, they'll proxy that back to the real login page. And at the end of this chain, what happens? You get logged in. Exactly like you're expecting. So you have no idea that you should report that anything is wrong. And that's bad, because if you look on the back end of things, again, not meant to be an eye test here, that's me logged in from California at the time, and there's the attacker logged in from somewhere in AWS that is being kind of geolocated to Virginia. This is bad, right? This is why you do phishing-resistant MFA, because while on any given day, we will catch somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million evil proxy attacks. Nothing's ever going to be 100%. And so phishing-resistant MFA is basically the best possible weapon against something like this. To a large extent, attackers are dependent on some of these techniques, but they're really kind of just remixing current social engineering to more or less achieve the same ends. Now, you get to do a little bit of an interactive exercise here. Points to whoever, actually, free gummies, not those kind of gummies, just regular kind of gummies. Depends on how fast you spot it. What's malicious about this message here? You can see on the left, there's the message with a Word document attached, and on the right, there's the contents of the Word document. Can anybody spot the thing that will get you owned? Phone number. Absolutely. Get that man some gummies. So nothing else is malicious here. There's no macro in the document. There's no embedded ISO file in the document. There's nothing clickable in the message. It's just the phone number. But if you call the phone number, you'll be socially engineered, probably into installing something like TeamViewer or some other remote management software, which so many of us rely on third parties to do forms of IT management. It's not showing up as malware in our environment, even though in most cases it's actually more effective than malware at getting done what it needs to get done. You don't have to look too much further than, say, recent events at MGM to see how varieties of this go horribly for victim organizations. This one's a little funnier, right? I figured every single organization, including us, which I'm a little bit mad about, honestly, are using QR codes today as part of a cybersecurity resilience summit. Attackers use this too, right? There has been an absolute flood of these over the summer, and what they're doing is figuring out just different ways to get a link in front of a user that don't always go through the stack of defenses that we have positioned, right? We are actually now having to spend money teaching our sandboxes to extract the URL from the QR code, campaign them where possible, and then actually figure out, is this pointing to credential phishing, is it pointing to malware, and do that full analysis. That's a really expensive thing to do. But if you get a user who gets this and they go to this on a mobile device, you probably don't have the same sort of defense in depth you have in other places. So yeah, there's innovation happening, but at the end of the day, that innovation is in the service of basically two things. At this point in time, as the gentleman from the FBI mentioned earlier, right, like, there are two attacker business models. You're doing some flavor of extortion, whether that's traditional ransomware or data extortion, or you're just stealing money. And the BEC actors that just steal money, maybe we don't respect their technical chops as much, but I think we all have a fair amount of respect for how successful they've been. And it is shocking that year after year after year after year, if you look at that IC3 data, business email compromise, with the brief exception of pig butchering showing up last year, is the most expensive form of cybercrime that there is, even though nothing is compromised in the traditional sense and no one's getting knocked offline. The other part of the standardization here, though, that I think is a little bit less remarked upon is there's this notion, everybody's heard of the attack chain, right? I think it's come up a couple times today. Anyone remember what the attack chain was called before it was the attack chain? I think given one particular outfit in the room, I think you might know, but it's this cyber kill chain, right? So that was developed at Lockheed all the way back in 2009. And unfortunately, things haven't had to change very much. And if you look at the current set of things that go into making an attacker successful, they've been pretty static for a while, right? If you're a ransomware actor, you probably use human-activated malware. You probably used Quackbot until pretty recently. Now you might be using a few of the alternatives. If you're looking to get VPN access, you're probably using that MFA collection phishing, something like Evil Proxy, which is dirt cheap and easy. And maybe there's an initial access broker that's then talking to a ransomware affiliate. That part can get complicated, but the tooling is basically the same. Once you're in, things are also getting incredibly standard. When was the last time you heard of a ransomware incident that somehow did not involve Active Directory? My most unbelievable story in that sense, and I can share it in a somewhat anonymized way. This is a Fortune 50 technology company, maybe even a Fortune 10 technology company. It was compromised by a ransomware actor. The ransomware actor got to SCCM and then went to Active Directory, which for those of you who are technical, you know that makes no sense, right? Because they already could do anything they wanted, but they went to Active Directory anyway because they only had one move, right? They're just the bishop on the chessboard that can only go diagonal. And it is unbelievable the extent to which they depend on Active Directory and Active Directory's nature, right? Everything is interconnected, everything can talk to everything else, and there's this notion of the domain admin for the on-prem side and the global admin for the Azure side that can do everything to all the things all at once. If that weren't built in, I don't think ransomware would be a thing like it is today. But we all live with Active Directory. We all have it. It was designed a quarter century ago, and we're all trying to muddle through that with our identity risk assessments and our journeys towards zero trust. And then once you get to the end of this, the actual data that is manipulated, encrypted, or stolen, almost none of that is happening through some novel, impressive, clever technique that we've never seen before. It's happening through accounts that actually have access to that data, that are just in the possession of somebody who shouldn't have them. So there's not too many different things going on here. And the one thing they have in common is that the vast majority of the time, they go through people. Now, there's lots of different ways to look at that data. You can use the Verizon report. I love what the MDR vendors like Red Canary do because they're just actually in real incidents all day, every day. But the initial access, everyone's going to have different numbers there. But yes, internet-facing vulnerabilities do exist. They are bad. You should patch stuff. But the vast majority of what is repeatable for the attackers, that they would have a very hard time living without, is initial access through a person, stealing creds, phishing either with malware or obviously just getting the credentials themselves. And once they're in, they have added some new tricks, right? You can look at Okta as a new vehicle for a couple of really interesting forms of lateral movement. MGM is an excellent example of that. But it is really all just about identities. Another reason I loved Marjorie's presentation, because that's where they started. You should absolutely put identity at the center of everything that you're doing, because attackers put it at the center of everything that they do. And the more that you're able to take away their preferred easy ways through an environment, the better you do. And then when you get to the final impact side, it is all about legit credentials, right? It's very, very, very rare that you see any kind of novel exfiltration technique. Yeah, you could airdrop stuff maliciously. It's theoretically possible. There's a new technique that came out a week ago where a university proved that through different browser tabs, you could use flaws in the GPU to observe the pixels on a different browser tab. That's extremely cool stunt hacking, but no one's going to use that to steal data because they'll just pop regular accounts that have all that access already and just use that. It's so much easier. Digging into this, though, how do we turn this into this? All right. Well, first, you do start by focusing on people. Be where the attackers are. If you look at the cybersecurity industry, and there's many, many, many things that are worth critiquing about the cybersecurity industry. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and most of it's not about people. Every October, we remember that people matter, and we spend a month talking to people about people things. But the other 11 months of the year, hey, that network is where all of my blinky light boxes are. I got to do some work there. Endpoints are really important. All these other things are important. But where the attackers make their living is people. If you look at the vast majority of breaches, it's going to start with an attack on a person or a credential. It's going to abuse an identity, and it's going to involve some legitimate identity used to compromise that data. So how do you make the attacker sad? Well, first off, try and take away as many of their opportunities to do initial compromise as possible. That looks different in different ways. There are different ways to skin this particular cat, but take away their ability to do credential phishing. You can do that through phishing-resistant MFA. You can do that through better defense in depth on the phishing attacks themselves. And the malware side of things, yeah, it definitely exists. It definitely runs through humans, but there's a couple of very obvious defense in depth things. Fewer attacks getting to inboxes, that's good. EDR on all devices, that's a baseline, but really more than that, you want people looking at those EDR logs if you're going to do a good job on the malware side. So much of this, though, is frankly not malware. The biggest trend, I think, in the last couple of years has been using our own tools against us. I mentioned AD, I mentioned Okta in the MGM example. Really, so much of the threat landscape is just using things that are already there and using them maliciously. This is a really critical point when it comes to identity deception. Right? There are things that are built into decades-old protocols like email, for example. All right, email is unauthenticated by default. Anybody can send an email pretending to be anybody else, unless you're doing this not totally obscure, but semi-obscure standard called DMARC that might prevent that from being delivered. Anyone want to guess what percentage of organizations in the world have a DMARC record? Yeah, it's just about 0.5%. It's actually slightly less than that. That's an excellent guess for the record. Even in the Fortune 1000, it's like 60%, right? And some of that is not even, don't deliver that if somebody pretends to be me from an IP address signing with keys that are definitively not mine. It's just, hey, be aware of that, right? Maybe quarantine that. Those are the sorts of things that are just way too easy and make it really easy to pretend to be somebody else on the internet. And it's not like the meme of the golden retriever when you're actually dealing with a cybercriminal. The other side of that is you do have opportunities to make it hard for attackers to do indirect things. Cloud account takeover is an obvious example. There's a completely different attack chain when it comes to the cloud, but it more or less has the same steps. And then, of course, there's the ability to compromise suppliers to then use to target their customers, which is a tried and true technique. At the end of the day, though, the attacker's after basically one of four things, or maybe a combination of them. They want to be domain user if they're trying to get to domain admin. They want that M365 account probably if they're going to try and steal money, because what does that M365 account give you? Gives you the ability to send email, the ability to search email, the ability to look for invoices and bank transactions and other things that you can use to figure out, hey, that's going from point A to point B. That money needs to go to me instead. That third part, data access, obviously something they are looking for, and then maybe they're just looking for direct financial authority as well. And so the middle stage of the attack chain is the second opportunity to make them sad. If you cannot escalate privilege and move laterally through AD, most attackers will simply give up. There is no plan B. The plan B is plan A somewhere else. And they have enough somewhere else's to do that reliably. Right? And then if you're talking about a more financially motivated actor, if you take away the ability to compromise Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace and do the basically abusive functions there, again, they'll probably give up and go somewhere else. And ultimately, that is a really simple way to minimize impact to critical data. So the things to summarize that attackers just cannot live without. The early set of kind of initial compromise-oriented tactics, pretty much the ones we've talked about. Targeted phishing, malware, social engineering attacks, cloud account takeover. And then if it's an internet-facing vulnerability, it's probably 9+. Otherwise, no one bothered to write an exploit for it because it requires too much work. If you take those things away, attacker very sad. In the middle, though, like assuming that doesn't work perfectly, which is always a good assumption, if you take away their ability to move around Active Directory, which is a non-trivial thing, that's very much aligned with an identity risk assessment, as Marjorie's session highlighted, it's a really valuable thing to do. At the very least, you should try and see what an attacker can see before they actually do that. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happens in practice in a minute. The last thing that would be good to take away, although it really kind of depends on who you're up against, is network-based lateral movement. Now, going back to the early days before the ZT acronym existed, there was a group actually that I was part of in London in 2004 called the Jericho Forum. No points for guessing the biblical reference there. But the whole notion back then was not really all that different than what we eventually came to brand as Zero Trust, which is basically that the network isn't a viable security perimeter. And it shouldn't be. You should not trust anything just because it happens to be on your network. That was because at the time, attackers knew how to move around a network, and defenders had a really hard time figuring out what was happening on a network. That was pre-NetFlow. that was pre really fancy NDR devices, and it was even really pre IDS actually working. I mean, it existed, but it was terrible, so no one really used it. And even if they did use it, no one paid attention to what it said. So networking became a really core part of that original idea because you had a lot of thinking that was devoted to attackers who knew how to move around a network with a standard set of tools, and they could be super noisy and they wouldn't get caught. They could land somewhere back in the day if you're doing pen testing and like run an Nmap scan and no one would snap you because they wouldn't notice. Like nobody was paying attention. In most organizations now, that's not true. Or there isn't a network that's worth exploiting to begin with because everybody's just kind of on the internet talking to SaaS applications. So the network is not where it ultimately matters. So it's actually really good to take that away, but the only attackers you're going to make sad have amazing beards, have been in it since the late 90s, and are legit cyberpunks who refuse to use the new stuff, right? Because it's not the real stuff, it's not real hacking, I'm not gonna do it, I'm not touching AD. There's like 10 of those people left. So that's why I qualify it with a maybe. At the end, though, you do have to deal with legitimate accounts that might belong to an attacker that might be abused to access data. That's a little bit trickier, but it does flow through humans too, and I'll get to that part in a moment. Now, there's innumerable examples that you can pick just from the last couple of weeks. You can go back a little further, and you can pick any of the ransomware families that the FBI talked about earlier today. It's, again, all the same stuff. Black Basta, I use it because Quackbot, right? Quackbot came this is the Capita attack in the UK for those who want the details. Quackbot was the initial delivery of the payload, install the backdoor, Mimikatz to exploit AD, get more privilege, turn off the EDR, remember that that's a thing that can happen, install some legitimate remote access tools, and then kind of do whatever you want at that point with very, very powerful accounts. Now, if you go all the way back to, I want to say 2009 or 2010, when Lockheed wrote the first kill chain paper, it's the same damn thing. I almost wanted to use the Pam meme from The Office, right? Corporate says it's the same picture, right? Because it's the same, right? It is the same sequence of steps with only incredibly minor variations. And I think that a lot of why we have not been more successful against adversaries is because they keep doing this and we're not making those specific things harder. If we do, again, we will really make them sad. The only meaningful difference here is that Office used to be full of hilarious bugs, and it's not as full of hilarious bugs anymore. Like the bugs that do pop up are, they are hilarious still, but they're really used more situationally. Like the only one that we saw really widespread exploitation of this year was a bug that I almost have to tell the story of because I don't think it got sufficiently appreciated at the time. Now, almost all of you have like Outlook calendar invites, right? And 15 minutes before or 5 minutes or whatever that little bell has been sent to, you get that bump, like little reminder tone. And if everybody's on a Zoom meeting, they all get it at a slightly different time, and it makes a really weird noise and lets everybody know that, hey, there's 15 minutes until the next meeting that we all have to go to. That sound, for reasons best explained by someone in Redmond and not me, is customizable. Why is it customizable? I have absolutely no idea. But it is customizable. And you can put code in that customizable sound and therefore craft a malicious Outlook invite that may or may not actually play a sound or not, but can dump an NTLM hash. Like, wild stuff. But every time you scrape a little bit of Windows, you see an ActiveX or just something horrible from 20 years ago. It's very Halloween, which is the other reason. We do this month in October. That one was almost exclusively used by Russian intelligence. It got patched, got used against exactly who you expect it to get used against. And yes, it's a hilarious bug. But are the rest of us up against that? Do we care? Probably not. It's going to get patched pretty quick. And the rest of the time, it's just going to be people sending us JavaScript and hoping our users run it. The attack chain remains more or less undisturbed unless we do something to disturb it. It's a little different, though, in the cloud. And this is a group that we've seen targeting Oregon before. They are also probably Nigerian in origin, and they love impersonating the US government. They like impersonating Commerce, Department of Transportation, a few others, and they have a couple of different plays. One play is Evil Proxy, because again, everybody uses it. It's cheap. Why wouldn't you use it? Sometimes they actually will deliver malware if they want to take over a machine. They like adding new MFA factors. If that's not something you alert on in your environment, you absolutely should. Core learning from the MGM incident that if the help desk can add new MFA factors to powerful accounts, very, very bad things can happen. The only caveat I would offer, and we've been on our own journey to phishing-resistant MFA. We've got it all done on the production side. I've got a YubiKey plugged into my computer right now. Two things. One, really pay attention to the account reset process. Because if you go through all that hard work and then you just transfer the vulnerability to a bunch of overworked help desk people, sadly, you're leaving a really big door open. Number two, always give everybody two things because they will 100% lose one of them. We give everybody a passkey and a YubiKey. It's an obvious thing. We have not yet seen somebody lose both of them at the same time. Not that it's impossible, but it's just substantially less likely and leads to a better outcome overall. Going to the core of this, though, because I'm gonna wrap soon. You know, this attacker though lives in the cloud, right? They like to send malicious emails from the accounts they compromise. They establish persistence via OAuth apps that connect to Microsoft 365 that a lot of organizations don't look for. I think, Marjorie, you mentioned, what, 1,500 apps, was it? There's a global tenant setting in M365. Can your users create apps? If that's on, attackers say, yes, I will create an app. I won't even bother to rename it. These guys, want to guess what their app is called? It's called app. They're too lazy to even rename the thing. And all it is basically a mechanism to interact with a mailbox, right? And it's the same thing they install for persistence every single time. So, couple of points here. I have gotten all the way to this point without using the particularly dreaded two-letter acronym. Hasn't anything changed? We heard so much about AI in this. It hasn't really changed much, honestly. Phishing emails, now they're really good in Japanese. But has it changed other ones? No. It's completely indistinguishable, which is, of course, what an LLM is supposed to do, right? It's more or less doing what we expect. Has it changed the malware world? In our data, absolutely not. Attackers have had these things called packers to create different forms of malware. It's still working just fine. Ultimately, though, it will change our interfaces. People will probably not have to look at dashboards too much longer, which is a great thing, but it's not really meaningfully impacting the threat landscape right now. So AI threats more or less look like regular threats. Now, I'm going to wrap with a couple of examples of ones we have seen. Anyone know who these guys are? Just to close, just a fun one. This is Vovan and Lexus. They are Putin's favorite comedians. This is them talking to J.K. Rowling. They pretended to be Zelensky and talking to her and got her to actually to say hello to these people. If anyone can read Cyrillic, that says basically Putin always on their shirts. But ultimately, this is about the most advanced thing we face. And are they using deepfakes here? Actually, no. They're using actors, and they're using disguises. So bankrolled by the Russian government, every technical advantage they could possibly have, but mustaches and fake beards are still what they end up relying on. And I wanted to give you one quick apex predator example before I wrap here. Apex predators like orcas. This is one we caught last year, actually, at the University College London. They still do call one of their schools the School of Oriental and African Studies. Please do not cancel me for saying that. This is a really serious Iranian actor, right? We track them as TA-453. You might know them as Charming Kitten. They are the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They were impersonating UK-based academics, and this is the most sophisticated university-based campaign we've seen in the last year. They managed to compromise the SOAS's website for their radio station. kind of bizarre that they have a radio station, but they were willing to actually invite their targets not just to a virtual conference, but to actual live Zoom meetings. So we now know that even though they are IRGC, they are based in Iran, they are comfortable talking to targets over video meetings in a way that we hadn't seen previously. And this was their phishing attack that they eventually launched. It was to activate your invitation, and hilariously, this is the bottom of that page. They gave you like 9 different options of ways ways to get yourself compromised. For those of you who remember Seinfeld, it's like the movie phone episode, right? Why don't you tell me what movie you want to see? Which is an insane thing to explain to anyone under the age of 30. I will not explain why movie phone even existed. But they basically, why don't you tell me which way you want to be fished today? And this is the most apex predator-like actor we track, right? So at the end of the day, they're doing interesting things, but they're not even doing as interesting things as the malware guys out there. Qbot's origin, before we took them down, again, Quackbot, was this campaign here. This looks probably like an extremely off-brand version of Netflix to you. But what this was an entire Qbot campaign where they did create a fake version of Netflix, complete with fake movies. I would 100% watch Dog Woof, by the way. I'm not watching the other 3. Just to give people fake invoices or like fake, I subscribe to this, it's $19.99 a month. Absolutely not. Please cancel my subscription. That was the lure, and they created an entire fake Netflix thing to do this. So yes, they will do all these things. They will move to some really interesting options, but at the end of the day, we can make them sad. The social engineering will be great, but if you understand in any organization who's getting those interesting attacks, who's likely to fall for them, and then critically, if they get compromised, how bad of a day is it? And that is a matter of getting to things like AD before an attacker does. That's that identity risk assessment piece, and it is incredibly powerful to do that before an attacker does. At the end of the day, though, that gets you to where you want to go, because attackers are still doing the same things. They might make fake Netflixes, they might compromise entire radio stations for some reason, but they're still doing the same thing in basically the same order. And if you can get their ability to leverage social engineering and identity to fail more often than it succeeds, they mostly give up. They will absolutely go after other targets. And increasingly, their best plays are to use our own tools against us, highlighted most critically by things like your identity providers and things like Active Directory. If you take that away from them and you stop that, you stop most of the evil that's out there. With that, I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, and I will turn it back over to Tiffany.